Hello and welcome to this tutorial on using a Silhouette Cameo and Silhouette Studio to cut Pepakura files. Right now I'm using Windows 10, and before this I was using Windows 8.1, so those are the only operating systems that I can guarantee that this works on, but it should work the same as long as you have the same or newer version of Silhouette Studio and Pepakura Designer. Right now Silhouette Studio is version 3.6.57 and Pepakura Designer is 3.1.8. I will update this video if I need to make any changes or something because of some software updates. Also, you want to check the firmware version of your Silhouette Cameo. Right now, the most recent version is version 160. I don't know if you can see that. I was having a lot of issues before I updated the firmware on my Silhouette Cameo, so make sure that that's the first thing that you do, and it's pretty simple to do. You just follow the little instructions inside that download. The file that I'm going to be using for this video is the Iron Man Mark 7 hip pods from Darkside 501st from the rpf.com. So we'll go ahead and just get started with this. The first thing that we're going to want to do is make sure that the paper settings for this file match the settings that we have for our printer. So I'll go into Settings, Print and Paper Settings. You just select your paper size and then make sure that you have 15mm margins. I know a lot of times if you're cutting with an X-Acto knife and you're doing it by hand, you want to set your margins as low as possible so that you can fit as many parts on the page as possible. But you need to have that extra margin space for registration on the Silhouette Cameo. So make sure that your margins are at least 15mm. Set the line weight to 4. Make sure that it's set to print lines smoothly and that the transparency is all the way to 0%. And then you're going to want to set your bitmap resolution to very high. And then the next thing that we're going to do is, well, this would be the point. This file doesn't have any issues, but if you ever run across a file that has, let's see if I can make it, whoops. If you ever have any overlap on your files, so for instance, right here, you can see that the flap on this lower part is underneath this part, and that happens quite a bit in a lot of models if you have like overlaps of flaps or parts or something, and it's kind of hard to do with the Silhouette Cameo. I mean, the software doesn't really like that too much, so it's a lot easier to just go ahead and edit your models a little bit so that you don't have any of that overlap, or edit the flaps or whatever you need to do just so that your parts aren't overlapping each other. So once you have that done, I'm going to turn the texture settings off so that it's just white and black right now, and then I'm going to color the cut lines and the the mountain lines and the valley lines. So the mountain lines I will set to blue, and I will set the valley lines to red. And then this little option right here, hide edges that are almost flat, this is something that, since we're using a CNC cutter to cut our bend lines, we don't need to hide that many edges, if that makes sense. We can just have the machine cut them, so it doesn't matter if there's a lot of edges, and it actually helps the overall assembly of this, and I can't quite get that to where I want it. So I'm going to go into Settings, I believe it's Other Settings. So this hide almost flat folding lines, this is the same option, and I'm going to set it to 178 degrees. So now you can see it's got these extra bends here, and that's just going to be useful for when we are actually gluing the parts together. It'll help the model kind of take its shape. So I need to make sure that those lines are colored. And then we can go ahead and get rid of those dashes. So I'm going to go into Settings, Other Settings, and set the mountain and valley fold lines to be solid lines instead of dashed. And so now we just have the solid red and blue lines. And the last thing that we're going to do is under 2D menu, Show Edge ID. And so now we have the edge IDs here on all of the faces. So that's basically what we need to do for every Pepakura file that you are going to be cutting with a Silhouette Cameo. You just set it so that you have solid, non-dashed lines with the colors, show the edge IDs, and then make sure you have no overlaps. And that can take It can be pretty quick, or it can take a lot of time depending on how the original model was unfolded. So once you've got all this done, we need to export this. We're going to export it as a DXF and as a bitmap. So if you go into File, Export, Vector Format, DXF files per sheet, this makes one DXF file per sheet of the model. And then save that as whatever you want. And then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do that one more time. File, Export, bitmap per sheet. Set the resolution. I usually just go 300 pixels per inch and click OK. Then this pops up just saying that it's going to add numbers since there's more than one page. So I name this hit pod. And there we go. We have hit pod 1 and 2 DXF, and then 1 and 2 bitmap. So now that we have the DXF and the bitmap files created, we're going to create I like to make like a blank file in Silhouette Studio. So I'm going to double click Silhouette Studio, launch this. I'm going to show you the general settings that you need to change, assuming like you just installed Silhouette Studio. So if you go down to the little settings icon in the bottom right hand corner here, open up the preferences. Under General, you want to set the resolution of the image sent to printer down here. You want to set that to the maximum resolution that your printer supports. So I have mine set to 1200 DPI. 1200 DPI. And like I said, make sure that it's the maximum of what your printer can support. Next, under Defaults, turn the registration marks on and enable this cut to edge of page. And then under Import Options, this line here, when importing a DXF, you want to make sure that that's imported as is, and that the make white lines black and join lines into polylines are both enabled. So what that importing as is does is it just makes sure that when you import the DXF, Silhouette Studio does not do any sort of scaling or moving of the data. It keeps it and makes sure that it's the correct size. I'm going to click Apply on that. Now, what we want to do, so I'm basically going to set this document up, or this Silhouette Studio file up for the Pepakura files, and then I'm going to save it as a blank Silhouette Studio file so that you can just copy and paste it, and to make more. I mean, it makes it a lot faster when you have like 20 pages worth of stuff that you have to do. So if your grid is enabled, at the top you just click View and select Show Grid, and that'll hide the grid. And then what we'll do is we'll make these registration marks take up a little less of the page. So if you click the registration marks window icon at the top right hand corner, and then these inset values, the left inset, top, right, and bottom inset, drop those as low as they go, 0.394, which I believe is just a little bit over 15 millimeters, and that's why we had the 15 millimeter margins in Pepakura. So you cannot have any image or vector lines or anything in these cross-hatched areas. So I'm going to save this file. I'm just going to name it blank. You'll see why in a minute here. So next thing we want to do is we're going to import the DXF files from the Pepakura. So the easiest way I found to do this is so these are my DXF files. I'm just going to drag them into my Silhouette Studio screen. And then just try to center them on the page as much as possible. So that's like I imported the data and placed it on the page. All I had to do is just click and drag my file in. So now I'm going to expand this back. So we've got our vector data here, and this is not the file that we're going to be actually cutting. The only reason I'm bringing this in is so that I have these red and blue lines so that I can set up the cut settings for the Silhouette Cameo. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go into the cut settings icon here, click that and loads in the cut settings. You're going to want to enable the advanced cut mode. And now see, we've got this blue, black, and red colors for our cut order. So make sure the cut order is set to line color, and we've had black, red, and blue. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create two material types. So the way this works is that each color has its own material assigned to it. So they're all assigned to vinyl. So for instance, if I assigned this black line to copy paper, only the black line is assigned copy paper. And so copy paper has different cut settings, it has a different speed and a different thickness than vinyl, and only the color that we have selected is what is changed. So this window where it shows the colors and the materials is the important, is the one that's going to determine your cut settings for that specific color. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to create two new materials. So I'm going to click this plus icon to create a new material, and I'm going to name this cut line, and then I'm going to create another one and name it bend line. The cut line we're going to set for cardstock to actually cut through. So we're going to set our blade depth to 4. We're going to set our speed to 4 centimeters per second. Is that seriously centimeters per second? That doesn't seem right, does it? Oh. Okay, in the general preference, so I went back into my preferences. In unit of length, set that to millimeters. Right, it was set to auto, set it to millimeters, apply. Now we go back into our cut settings. That's still centimeters per second. Okay. So the speed is 4 centimeters per second. In the thickness, you're going to want that maximum. That's 33 units. And that should be it for cut line. So what we did right here is we edited the material type. So we're saying that anytime we are cutting the material that is cut line, it's going to have a speed of 4 centimeters per second, a thickness of 33. Our blade is going to be set to 4. And then, so next what we're going to do is we're going to set the black lines to have the cut line as the material. So anytime it's going to be cutting the black lines, it's going to have the blade depth of 4, speed of 4, thickness of 33, etc. Next we'll edit the bend line, and this, to cut those bends, since this is not a full cut through, this is just cutting it's just scoring along that edge. So we're going to set the blade depth to 1, set the speed 7 or 8, you can go all the way up to 10 if you want, and the thickness, drop that down to 1. So that's the settings for the bend line. Now that we have that defined, I'm going to go back into, now that we have the material types defined, the bend line and the cut line, I'm going to make sure that I assign the correct lines to the correct colors in my material types here. So the blue lines are all bend lines, the black lines are cut lines, and the red lines are bend lines. So now we have cut line, bend line, cut line. So what we're going to do now is we're going to rearrange these cuts and then add a pause so that we can change the blade depth in between cuts. So, and this will all make a lot more sense once you actually see the Silhouette Cameo cutting the material. So I'm going to click and drag the cut lines below the bend lines. So now it goes bend line, cut line. And then I'm going to right click on my second bend line, and I'm going to click add pause. And so that just creates a pause in between the bend lines. So now what we can do is we can set our blade depth to 1, have the Silhouette Cameo go through and score all the bend lines, and it'll pause waiting for us to resume so that we can change the blade depth to 4, and then when we resume, it'll do all the cut lines. And this is the general format that we're going to have for all the pieces that we cut. So now that we have these cut lines set up, we have our registration marks set up, we have pretty much everything set up for this. I'm going to save this file. This is my blank. I'm just going to go File, Save. This is my blank file. excuse me, I'm going to delete this DXF file save. Now, this is my blank file. So this, if you're doing a series of parts that have 20 pages, you have your blank file, and then all you have to do is just copy paste. And now I have these two blanks, so I'm just going to rename these hit pod 1, hit pod 2, and so now I have these two files. So I'm going to close out of my blank file, open hit pod 1, and that has all of the settings that we just set with the cut lines and everything. So I'm going to import this DXF again, click and drag. That imports the DXF file. And if I look at my cut settings, you can see it has the correct materials assigned. It does not have that pause. So I didn't have it in the right order. So now we have red, or blue, red, so these are both bend lines, and then a pause, and then our cut line. So once we have that set up, now we need to drag in the edge IDs. So if you go to the hit pod 1 bitmap, the first bitmap, when you click and drag, you don't want to drop it onto any of the DXF lines. If you do that, you'll have all sorts of issues with it trying to merge with the DXF. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag hit pod 1 off to the top here. And this is a huge image. It's covering pretty much everything. So the first thing we're going to do is right click on that image and then send it to back, and then make sure that it's behind the cut lines. And then instead of trying to find the corner of the image and dragging it so that you're scaling it down, it's actually easier if you just make sure that you have the image selected and you click the scale icon. And right now the width, depending on what system of units you have, let's see, I need to get a calculator out here. Since we know that the paper is going to be depending on your whatever system of units you're using, depending on the size of paper you're using, letter size paper is 8.5 inches. Convert that to millimeters, 215.9 millimeters. And since we have 15 millimeter margins on each side, that's 30 millimeters total, so we'll subtract 30 from that. That means that this image should be 185.9 millimeters, or 7.319 inches. Multiply that back. 185.9 millimeters. And now it should be the correct size for the page. So then you can just drag the image onto your DXF file and then zoom in a little bit until you are comfortable with how aligned the picture is. Then I'll zoom back out, and there, this file is now ready for printing and cutting. So I'm going to save this and then open hit pod 2, and this is just going to be the same thing. I'm going to drag the DXF file on, I'm going to drag the bitmap file, right click, send to back, make sure that my image is selected, go to the scale window and change the width to 185.9 millimeters. And you're going to want to make sure, I don't know if I mentioned this before, you're going to want to make sure that the lock aspect option is enabled, just to make sure that it keeps the same aspect ratio. And then you just try to align this picture. It doesn't matter if you have the image overhanging the paper, that won't affect anything. So I'll zoom in, make sure that these images are aligned, zoom back out, file, save. And now all we will be doing is sending these files to our printer. Now, the printer is only going to print the non-vector items that are on this page. So basically, it's only going to print the image. It's not going to print the vector data or anything. So in hit pod 1 here, I'm just going to click send to printer. I'm going to select my printer. Click. Okay, so this is important. You're going to want to go into preferences and then set your print quality to 2400 dpi or whatever the maximum resolution is that you can set your printer to. and then also make sure you select that it is thicker paper or cardstock or whatever whatever option you have there. I can only go to thicker paper, and then the print quality is 2400 dpi. Click OK and apply, and so that makes sure that the printer knows that it's printing thick paper, and it knows that it's and it prints a high resolution image, and that's really important for the registration marks. So then if I click print, and that's going to print HitPod 1, and then I can go to HitPod 2 and do the same thing. I'm going to go back into the preferences, make sure it's fine, thicker paper, okay, print. And so now these two files are going to print. So I'm not sure if I made sure to set the cut settings. Nope, I have not set the cut settings on this yet. So now that we've got these files printed, we can take a look at these pages. This is what came out of the printer. Looks like I smudged a little there. You can see they're kind of bowed. So eventually, as your cutting mat loses its adhesiveness, the corners like to start peeling up while it's cutting in the Cameo. So what I usually do is I ended up just rolling the papers up, and that just kind of forces those edges to curl back a little bit. So now I'll load up this is page 1. I cannot believe how bad that smudged. So in case you didn't notice, my Cameo is a little messed up. I tried to play around with the microcontroller that's on it, and I ended up breaking the connection to the LCD screen, so I can't press the same button that you guys would have to load the cutting mat. That does kind of it makes a few things a little harder than they should be, but I found a little trick that I can do this way. Now, instead of pressing the button to load the cutting mat with the paper on it, all I do is I load my paper on 1 inch below where you usually would load the paper, and I haven't turned the Cameo on yet. So what I'll do is just take my cutting mat, align it up, and just push it under the rollers. Just have it right about here, and now I power the machine on. And so what that does is now every time the machine is shut off, or excuse me, every time the machine finishes cutting, it will return to this location. It won't actually eject the cutting mat. So now I have this nice place. I can just go ahead and put once this is done cutting, I just pull my parts off and then put my new paper on here without ever having to take the cutting mat and put the new paper on, then load the cutting mat again. And now I get the machine ready for cutting the fold lines. I have my let's see if I can get this in the webcam here. This is the ratchet cutter, or whatever they call this. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to set the depth, the blade depth, using this little spot inside the Cameo here. I rotate it so that the red line is there on number 1. So it's saying that our blade depth is set to 1. And then I load it up in my carrier here, lock that in, and now we're ready to go for cutting the fold lines. So back in the software, go into Silhouette Studio, make sure we have HitPod 1 selected, go into the cut settings menu again, make sure that we have the red and blue lines are set to bend line, the black line is set to a cut line, and then we have the pause in between them. And now when I send a silhouette, so this is where that LED screen would be handy because it could automatically register. I don't have that, so instead I have to manually register. So I have to manually move the machine in and basically just positioning the tip of the cutter in the center of the top left rectangle for registration. And then I click register. And now it'll go through and register. Whoops. Now it'll go through and register, and then once it's done, it will do the red and blue lines. And there it finished doing the bend lines, so now it's going to pause and wait for me to switch out the blade. So I'll just take the blade, set the blade depth to 4. Oh no, that's just not trying to focus. Yeah, blade depth is set to 4. Place it back in the carrier, lock it, and then in the software, I just click resume cutting. So there, it doesn't have to, it's not going to re-register. It's not, you don't have to re-register in between the cuts or anything. And assuming that the fold lines were accurate enough, then this should be accurate as well. Now that it's finished the page, I'll just peel the main page off. And there's the finished parts in there. If you got the Silhouette Cameo from, I don't remember where I got this, most of them come with this little spatula guy that is pretty handy to getting these parts off of the cutting mat. And there's the finished parts from this page. And then the procedure is the same exact thing for the second page. If your machine isn't broken like mine, all you have to do is just set load your cutting mat with the next page on it. So for mine, I'm just going to place the next page on the cutting mat. Change my blade depth back to 1. And then in the software, change to the second hit pod page, open my cut settings, make sure that these are in the correct order, bend, pause, cut, send to Silhouette. Now I'll manually register it again. And there it paused, so now I'm going to change my blade depth to 4. And resume cutting. And there you have it. So this method is pretty fast if you have a bunch of pages to do. If you got 20 pages, you just create as many of those blank Silhouette Studio files as you need to, and then you just drag and drop the DXF, drag the bitmap file on there, scale it, make sure that your cut settings are correct, and then cut. And it should save a lot of time not having to re-register in between the red and blue lines and the cut lines. One thing that does happen is that some of the line, I'm sure this won't show it on the webcam, some of the cut lines don't show up, or sorry, they don't line up with the actual cut very well. Yeah, that's not going to focus, is it? I don't know if you actually see it or not. But the advantage of doing the fold lines, like the scoring and the cut lines, without re-registering, is that as long as you don't miss a step in the Silhouette Cameo, that the bend lines and the cut lines should match each other. Like they should be perfectly aligned to each other. They may not be perfectly aligned to the lines that you printed on the printer. So there may be, if you get some of the pens with the Silhouette Cameo, the red and blue pens, there might be some advantage to using the red and blue pens to do this instead of printing those lines out with the printer. And that would just be for making sure that the bend lines are perfectly lined up with the cuts. And that does help when you're gluing the parts together. You know, if the lines are not perfectly centered to each other, then you have some issues with trying to line up the faces that you're gluing and the tabs. So that is it for this tutorial. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks for watching.